Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe, but today I want to talk about Mark Zuckerberg because quite frankly, I think there are very few people in modern history that have done more damage, essentially, to society, to our privacy, to even democracy than he has. And quite frankly, if you have been watching or listening to me in whatever form for years, literally 5+ years now, you know my thoughts on Facebook. You know my thoughts on Instagram, every other Meta, aka Facebook property that is out there, and my thoughts on Mark Zuckerberg. I did a video, I want to say it's about 4 years now, basically entitled, "It's Time to Put Mark Zuckerberg in Jail," where I detailed for about half an hour the absolute litany of sins and crimes that this company has done, that he has basically been the leader of. And it gets worse. There has been so much stuff that has come out in the last 4 years. And what happened today essentially just really kind of underscores exactly the problem that we have. That it's really not about the ethics or helping society, even though, there have been study after study of the damage and they keep ignoring it. And we're going to talk about these things today. But we are essentially drowning in misinformation and disinformation. I don't care what you believe politically. I don't care, if you're on the left or the right or whatever. We're going to talk about the facts on the ground. And we're going to start basically with Gareth Vipers of the Wall Street Journal, who had a pretty good write-up of what Zuckerberg just came out with today. And quite frankly, I find this absolutely disgusting on Zuckerberg's behalf. And so with that, let's dive in, because Meta, aka Facebook, Instagram, Threads, etc., everything they own, is essentially ending fact-checking and removing restrictions on speech across Facebook and Instagram. This is a move that Mark Zuckerberg says is an attempt to restore free expression on his platforms. Now, I think that on its face is pretty ridiculous. And we're going to dive into this, but I think it's important to understand where Zuckerberg is coming from. And I quote Mr. Zuckerberg himself: "We're going to get back to our roots and focus on reducing mistakes, simplifying our policies, and restoring free expression on our platforms. More specifically, we're going to get rid of the fact checkers and replace them with community notes similar to X, starting in the US." End quote. Now, quite frankly, I disagree with that. And we're going to talk about why. But the Wall Street Journal thinks, as Gareth Viper writes, that this move is essentially to help build ties with the incoming Trump administration, and the evidence that Mr. Viper cites is indeed compelling towards this logic. And let's look at that evidence. I did go through and verify that these things actually happened. So, with that, the day before Thanksgiving, mind you, this is after the election, and then candidate Trump is now President Trump during Thanksgiving, because the day before Thanksgiving, Zuckerberg dined with Donald Trump essentially at Mar-a-Lago. On top of it, Meta, aka Mark Zuckerberg, who owns it, runs it, founded it, etc., donated $1 million to Trump's inaugural fund. This past week, Meta installed a former aide to President George W. Bush, Joel Kaplan, as a global policy chief executive, essentially boosting ties to the Republican Party, that which Trump basically runs. So Kaplan, FYI, has been at Meta since 2011 and has served as a conduit to Republicans in Washington, D.C. and broader conservative ecosystems as well. And obviously, he's getting a big visual boost. Now, interestingly enough, President George W. Bush himself has been incredibly quiet on Donald Trump, not coming out and endorsing him or deriding him, to be fair, and so here we are. Now, on top of this, the company, aka Meta, literally yesterday said that UFC President Dana White, who's a very staunch reporter and ally of the president-elect, would be among the 3 new members of its board of directors. So, understanding all of that evidence, and again, I don't care about your politics, these are the things that are actually happening, you could absolutely make the argument that Mark Zuckerberg is doing this to get into the good graces of the incoming president. So it really does seem like he's aligning, or at least trying to align, with Donald Trump. And to be fair to Mark Zuckerberg and to just business logic in general, Trump has stated multiple times during the campaign in the last 4 years after the 2020 election that he essentially wants retribution on who he perceives as an enemy. And so it's logical for Mark Zuckerberg basically not to want to be on the bad side of the sitting US president. I mean, think about it. He's running a company that's not quite worth $1 trillion, but it's worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And the last thing you would want to do is have the entire government apparatus that your business is sitting in essentially come after you on behest of the President of the United States if he doesn't get into line. And so, for the record, Zuckerberg also isn't alone here, but for the record, we will basically be focusing on him overarchingly. But since he's not alone, we have to talk about some of the others quickly. So essentially, Meta's decision to remove restrictions on certain types of speech does echo the approach taken by Elon Musk after he bought Twitter and turned it into X, basically in 2020. I've written articles and talked about that. You can go read and listen or watch all of that. And personally, I think Zuckerberg may be kicking himself, honestly, for letting Musk get into Trump's inner circle first, given the influence that can essentially create for Elon Musk. And we've seen that as Elon Musk is now basically going into other countries like the United Kingdom and Germany and basically giving his opinions there, attempting to influence in his global platform that he now has. And Musk, for the record, has criticized Zuckerberg's platforms for removing content that were seen to violate Facebook's or Instagram's, etc.'s community standards. Now, in December, Elon Musk posted basically accusing Meta's platforms of censoring conservative voices. Now, I will say this, though. There have been several studies over the years looking at this, as this has been essentially a charge that has happened. Oh, they're basically censoring conservative voices. I've seen accusations from the left as well on this, and there has been a lot of studies that show no. If anything, Facebook has really helped galvanize the conservative movement, not just behind Donald Trump, but for other causes as well. And that's not really censorship if they're growing and coordinating on Facebook. Now, I understand the balance here. If people are angrily spouting off screeds or rants that could be considered racist or sexist or whatever, that can come from any side of the political spectrum, that essentially the AIs would kick in and say, hey, this goes against our community's standards. I've had friends on Facebook that have posted stuff that have been blocked. I have posted stuff either humorously or innocuously that the AI trips up with, but I challenge it or whatever, and usually it goes away. So back to Mark Zuckerberg here, and essentially his video announcement on killing all the fact checkers basically in Meta's platforms. Now, Zuckerberg directly referenced Trump several times in the video, criticizing the legacy media for their coverage of his first term in office. This parrots essentially exactly what the president-elect has been saying as well. He also said that the fact checkers had become, quote, too politically biased, end quote. I quite frankly would like to see studies on that to see exactly what they're talking about, or if this is just off the cuff. And we will talk about why we should see studies on that in a moment here. Now, Meta implemented its third-party fact-checking function after the 2016 election in what it said was an effort to restrict misinformation and the spread of false news on its platforms. And that absolutely happened. Like, we have so much unbelievable evidence. I have personally gone through and looked at the Internet Research Agency's 3,500 to almost 4,000 ads where you can literally see Russian intelligence buying specific ads in specific locales to drive wedges into everything from, let's say, minorities to conservatives to liberals, trying to drive us apart. Not to mention the fact that we have indeed seen that. Facebook had even gone to the point where they were kind of trying to do this for any kind of advertising as well. I occasionally boost a video or two of mine on Facebook, just to see what it will do in terms of the impressions and all that, like $5 here or whatever. And when I posted something in that era that was potentially brushing up against politics, they wanted me to verify who I was. In other words, giving them a driver's license. They would send me like a card in the mail that I would have to fill out and send back from my address. It wasn't a perfect system, but they were actually trying. And as much crap as I give Facebook, and I will continue to do that, they did have an attempt. Now, in 2019, Meta drew the ire of some employees when it said it would not fact-check paid-for advertising by political candidates. Not me, because I'm not running for office, but those that are running from dog catcher to president would suddenly have a free rein to say whatever they wanted. This includes anybody that, let's say, is running that is a conspiracy theorist that has baseless information or information not based in fact, and put it out there. And now that was essentially taken as gospel. Not to mention those accounts are verified, so they had an air of authority. So I want to talk now, that's the backdrop of this. I want to talk now about the longitudinal harm that Mark Zuckerberg has done And for the record, don't forget to check out my past videos, my past segments, audio on this. It's Time to Put Mark Zuckerberg in Jail was one of my most popular videos back in the day. It really lays it all out with sourcing and referencing and all this kind of stuff. So with that, we can't forget what Mark Zuckerberg through Facebook, Instagram, now Threads, and his other social media platforms that he's got have done. First things first, the data privacies have been prolific, they have been rife, and they have been downright criminal. Cambridge Analytica was basically data mining us and our friends for psychological profiles to settle political campaigns. It was used by Ted Cruz. It was used by the Trump campaign. It was used by Steve Bannon and a whole bunch of others. They literally had a congressional hearing over that where Zuckerberg made money because Congress had no idea how to ask him on that. On top of it, we now have research that shows over 100,000 Amazon AWS S3 buckets filled with Facebook data, meaning your data and my data on Facebook had been copied out and extracted from Facebook by God knows who. Facebook can't tell us. Their engineers said the data is so big, they really can't control it. They've had massive GDPR violations, hundreds of millions of dollars year over year on this. No changes whatsoever, basically, beyond lip service. They literally have, I think, an operating budget just for this to pay these fines. That's been a huge thing. On top of it, we have originally correlated evidence. Now we have conclusive evidence that essentially the massive mental health crisis that we have seen across the globe, across many different societies, including here in the United States, essentially started with the social media era. We had basically smartphones. We were connected 24/7, forward-facing cameras. I don't blame Zuckerberg for that, but Meta, aka Facebook, came around and it all exploded. Mental health crisis. We had a mental health crisis in addiction of adults, in addiction for adults, rife depression, all this kind of stuff. Not to mention a lowering of actual in-person communication. We're not going to community centers or churches or mosques or synagogues or whatever anymore, and we are staying more online, more sedentary as a result of it. We have a major mental health crisis in young adults to older adults, but we also had a huge mental crisis in our kids. Ramping up of depression, ramping up of suicidality for both young boys and young girls, to the point where studies by Jonathan Haidt, Gene Twenge, who wrote iGen, and a whole bunch of others have essentially confirmed this, and we'll talk about that even more in a second. But that has been a massive, massive problem. Cyberbullying on top of it. They did very little to try to control this whatsoever, and now they're just getting rid of this. On top of it, we have the ramp up of extremism. We saw domestic violent extremists start to use the platform to actually recruit. Facebook's AI, as of a couple of months ago, was actually creating basically these groups for them. I did a video slash podcast slash radio segment on that. You can go watch that video or listen to it. On top of it, we saw live streaming of violent acts like the Christchurch shooter and all of that, which was basically stirring up domestic violent extremists, extreme rhetoric, et cetera, et cetera. Now we've become more decentralized as they tend to use Discord or Telegram or a whole bunch of other platforms. There are also smaller social media platforms, but Facebook is the largest social media platform and continues to grow and continues to drive this. On top of it, we have seen disinformation campaign after disinformation campaign, understanding that disinformation is the intent to essentially disseminate false information. Misinformation is the unknowing person that reads it, believes it, and shares it in an altruistic nature. Disinformation by foreign intelligence agencies from China, from Russia, and a whole bunch of other countries, Iran, et cetera, continue to hit these platforms. That's part of why the fact checkers were there. Community notes can be co-opted. We've seen that with Twitter and /X. I've done segments on that as well. This is a huge issue. On top of it, quite frankly, we've seen the dumbing down of America. I really believe that. Right now, our average adult reading level is 6th grade level. People are not paying attention to whether it's important things like politics or the news or whatever. We're distracted by social media. We're distracted by the Kim Kardashians, the sports teams, etc. Everybody needs a release. I'm not knocking you if you're watching basketball or whatever. That's totally cool. For God's sakes, I'm sitting here right now wearing an LA Kings hockey jersey. But we have to make sure that we are prioritizing proper logic, proper news, proper education. Our adversaries are leveraging Facebook. They have been forever, basically, to divide us. Conspiracy theories are running rampant, and worse. This is a huge issue. On top of it, we have seen literal war crimes basically as a result of Facebook being leveraged. A genocide in Myanmar tied to disinformation delivery by the Myanmar government that basically launched a coup and then started going after basically the Rohingya Muslim population in there, slaughtering relentlessly. On top of it, we've seen the selling of stolen goods in war zones, which is considered a war crime by the Geneva Convention, and more. On top of it, we've had whistleblowers that have come out that have confirmed everything that I have just said. Think about Frances Haugen and the internal studies that Facebook was doing on essentially its own people, its own psychologists. They knew they were harming kids. They knew that the ramping up of depression, suicidality, etc. was directly caused by Facebook and other social media platforms. But Facebook was looking at Facebook, and Mark Zuckerberg had that crushed. Now, what little control they did try to have is going to be non-existent, and they've been cutting their safety teams for about 2 years now or so. I've done segments on that you can go watch. Now it's going to be non-existent. Now it's essentially going to be a free-for-all. Facebook is going the way of Twitter. And Twitter has drastically changed since Musk took it over, I think personally for the worst. Not because the political rhetoric has ramped up, but because he's changed the algorithms to prioritize. Musk has what Musk wants. I had a wonderfully curated feed on Twitter before Musk showed up, where I could get news sources around the world. I oftentimes use those news sources for my daily videos, my radio show, all this kind of stuff. And now I'm scrolling through it, and it's nothing but just fundamentally what Musk's politics are for the day of people I don't even know, I don't follow. This is essentially what we're going to see. It's going to be a free-for-all. It's going to get worse, which means if they're not checking, it's going to mean disinformation ramp up. It's going to mean all of these different kinds of things. Mark Zuckerberg has done more damage to the fabric of society, the fabric of democratic institutions, to our children, to our self-esteem, to our mental health, to our privacy, and on and on and on. It is time, once again, to try and put Mark Zuckerberg in jail.